Hey guys, welcome back. I really hope you're having a wonderful day, or a wonderful night, more likely if you're here. Today we're going to talk about something that millions of people have on their skin right now. Something that has been with humanity for longer than writing, longer than the wheel, longer than almost anything we'd think to call civilization. We're going to talk about tattoos, where they came from, why people got them, and how this ancient practice travelled across the entire world to end up on the arms, necks and ankles of your co-workers, your grandmother, and probably that one guy at the gym who you're pretty sure has never actually read the Bible, but has a very large cross on his back anyway. But before we dive in, if you truly enjoy what I do here, please consider subscribing. It would genuinely mean the world to me. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I am always thrilled to see that people are tuning in from every corner of the planet. Okay, let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Oldest Ink. Prehistoric Tattoos and Ötzi, the Iceman. Close your eyes for a moment. Well, don't actually close them, you're trying to read. But imagine, if you will, that you are standing in the Alps. It is roughly 3,300 years before the birth of Christ, which puts us somewhere around 5,300 years ago, give or take a century or two. The air is sharp and thin, the snow under your feet is packed hard, you're wearing animal skins, you're carrying a copper axe, and you are, by all available evidence, not having a particularly good day. You are Ötzi. You don't know that yet, of course. The name Ötzi won't be invented for another 53 centuries, coined by journalists in 1991 when a pair of German hikers stumbled across your remarkably well-preserved body, sticking out of a glacier near the Ötztal Alps on the border of Austria and Italy. Right now, in your final moments, you're simply a middle-aged man, about 45 years old, which in your era is practically ancient, who has been shot in the back with an arrow and is bleeding out in the snow. It is not a dignified end. But here is what's remarkable about you, Ötzi. Aside from the fact that you survived for 5,000 years in a glacier and still managed to look better than some people do on a Monday morning, you have tattoos. 61 of them, in fact, distributed across your body in a very deliberate and considered way. Lines on your wrists, groups of parallel lines on your lower back, a cross-shaped mark behind your left knee, stripes on your ankles, and what is perhaps most interesting to the researchers who have spent decades studying your frozen remains. These tattoos are not decorative. They are not pictures of animals or symbols of gods or declarations of love for a woman named Brunhilde. They are lines, simple, precise lines, placed with startling accuracy directly on or near the joints and areas of your body that show signs of arthritis and degenerative disease. This is a significant detail, because what it suggests, and this is the theory that many researchers have come around to, is that Ötzi's tattoos may have been therapeutic in nature, a form of treatment, the ancient equivalent of slapping a pain patch on a sore knee, except instead of a patch, you're using a sharp implement and soot. The placement of the tattoos corresponds so closely to traditional acupuncture points, in fact, that some scientists have speculated Ötzi may represent evidence of acupuncture-like practices 2,000 years before they appear in Chinese medical texts. Now, to be fair, not everyone agrees with this interpretation. Some researchers think the therapeutic angle is overstated and that we should be careful about reading too much into the placement. We are, after all, talking about a man who died 5,000 years ago and cannot exactly weigh in on the debate. He has no opinion, officially, but the correlation between his tattoos and his arthritic joints is striking enough that it cannot simply be dismissed as coincidence. These markings were placed by someone with knowledge of the body, of pain, of where to put ink to do something useful. How were Ötzi's tattoos made? The technique, as best as researchers can determine, involved making small incisions or punctures in the skin and then rubbing in a carbon-based pigment, essentially charcoal or soot. This is, in its fundamental mechanics, not entirely different from how some tattoos are made today. The tool was different, probably a sharp flint or bone, and the environment was different, an alpine landscape, rather than a climate-controlled studio with good lighting and a playlist. But the basic principle was the same. Break the skin, get the pigment underneath, let it heal. Ötzi's tattoos were discovered when his body was found in 1991, but it took years of careful examination under different lighting conditions, including infrared photography, to map all 61 of them. Many were nearly invisible to the naked eye, obscured by the darkening of his skin over millennia of preservation in ice. This is worth pausing on for a moment. These tattoos were so well preserved, so deeply embedded in the tissue, that they survived more than 5,000 years of being frozen in a glacier. The permanence of tattoos, which we sometimes think of as a modern concern. Will I regret this when I'm 60? Turns out to be something that Ötzi's tattooist understood very well. What goes in, stays in. Ötzi is currently the oldest tattooed human being we have found, but, and this is an important but, he's not necessarily the first person who ever received a tattoo. He's simply the oldest person whose tattoos we can still see. The practice almost certainly predates him. How far back does it go? That is a question we cannot fully answer, because tattoos by their nature require skin to survive, and skin does not survive well in the archaeological record. Bones last, pottery lasts, stone carvings last. Skin generally does not. But there are clues. Sharp, pointed implements that researchers believe may have been tattooing tools have been found at sites going back tens of thousands of years. Pigments, particularly ochre and carbon black, have been found in contexts that suggest deliberate use on the body. Cave paintings depict human figures with markings on their skin. None of this is definitive proof of tattooing specifically. These tools could have been used for other purposes. These marks could be artistic convention rather than literal depictions. But the accumulating picture is one of body marking as an ancient, perhaps even prehistoric human practice. There is a theory, held by some anthropologists, that body decoration, including tattoos, may have been one of the first forms of symbolic behaviour in modern humans. That the urge to mark the body is not a cultural invention that appeared at some specific moment in history, but something far more fundamental, something that comes with being human. The desire to say, with permanent marks on your own flesh, I was here, I belong to something, I believe something, I have been through something, I am someone. Whether or not that theory is correct, it sets the stage for what we're about to explore together over the next several hours, because the history of tattoos is, in a very real sense, the history of humanity itself. Every culture that has ever existed on this earth has had some form of body marking. The specific practices differ enormously. The meanings differ enormously. The tools, the pigments, the rituals surrounding the act, all different. But the impulse, the deep human desire to put something permanent on the skin, appears to be nearly universal. We will start as we should at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we can get. Chapter 2. Ancient Egypt. Tattoos on the banks of the Nile. You are in Egypt. The year is approximately 2000 BCE, though let's not be too precise about it. We're dealing with ancient history, and a century or two either way is basically a rounding error when you're talking about things that happened 4,000 years ago. The Nile is wide and brown and moves with the steady, unhurried confidence of a river that knows it is the reason civilization exists in this part of the world. Along its banks, there are farmers and priests and merchants and scribes, and somewhere among them there are people with tattoos. We know this because of mummies. Egyptian mummification, which preserved bodies with remarkable effectiveness, has given us an extraordinary window into ancient Egyptian life, including, it turns out, ancient Egyptian tattooing. The earliest and most significant examples come from a group of female mummies found at Deir, El Bahari and other sites, dating to the Middle Kingdom period, roughly 2000 to 1800 BCE. These women had tattoos on their thighs, lower abdomens and upper arms, dots, dashes, and geometric patterns rendered in a blue-black pigment. For a long time, there was significant debate among Egyptologists about what these tattoos meant and who these women were. Some early researchers, working in the 19th and early 20th centuries with assumptions that now look embarrassingly dated, concluded that the tattoos indicated these women were of low social status, perhaps dancers or entertainers, perhaps even women who worked in the oldest profession. The tattoos, in this reading, were a mark of marginalization. But subsequent research has largely overturned this interpretation. We now know that at least some of these tattooed women were of high status. Priestesses, possibly, associated with the cult of Hathor, the goddess of love, music, beauty and fertility. The placement of the tattoos on the thighs and lower abdomen in particular has led researchers to the theory that the tattoos had a protective or magical function specifically related to fertility and childbirth. Hathor was a goddess associated with these things, and having her symbols marked on the body in the most vulnerable areas during pregnancy may have been understood as a form of divine protection. This is a pattern we will see again and again throughout the history of tattooing. The tattoo as a form of spiritual armour. The ink is not just decoration, it is a claim on the protection of something larger than yourself. It says, "I carry this power with me. It is written on my skin. It cannot be taken away." In 2018, a significant discovery expanded our understanding of Egyptian tattooing considerably. Researchers examining 2 mummies from the Deir el-Medina site, a workers' village near the Valley of the Kings, where the artisans who built the royal tombs lived, found tattoos that were markedly different from those found on the earlier female mummies. These tattoos, on a female mummy who lived around 1300 BCE, included depictions of lotus flowers, seated baboons, a wadjet eye, and figures of the gods Bes and Taweret, both deities associated with protection during childbirth. But most strikingly, the tattoos also included what appeared to be a seated cow deity on the neck and the upper arm, imagery far more complex and figurative than the geometric patterns found on earlier tattooed mummies. This discovery pushed back the timeline of figurative tattooing in Egypt significantly, and suggested that Egyptian tattooing was more varied and sophisticated than previously understood. It also reinforced the idea that tattooing in Egypt was closely tied to religious practice and protective magic, that the images on the skin were understood to have real power, real efficacy in the spiritual economy of the ancient Egyptian world. What tools were used? The best evidence we have comes from sets of bronze instruments found at various Egyptian sites that have been identified as tattooing tools. These typically consist of flat-ended instruments with 1 or more sharp points, designed to be used in a group to create rows of dots, essentially a multi-needle tool not entirely unlike what is used in hand-poke tattooing today. The pigment was likely carbon-based, soot or lamp black, which explains the blue-black colour of the preserved tattoos. It's also worth noting that Egypt was not operating in isolation. This is a civilization that traded extensively with its neighbours, with Nubia to the south, with the Levant to the northeast, with Libya to the west and across the Mediterranean. The spread of tattooing practices and the ideas behind them would have followed these trade routes and diplomatic contacts. Egypt was not where tattooing began, and it was not where it ended. It was one node in a vast network of human cultures, all doing their own versions of the same deeply human thing. Let us now travel east. Chapter 3: Ancient China and the Silk Road. Incan identity in East Asia. You're in China. More specifically, you're somewhere in what is now the Xinjiang region, in the far northwest of the country, somewhere around 1000 BCE, give or take several centuries on either side. You're a member of one of the nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples who moved across the steppes of Central Asia, cultures that existed in Neol, the spaces between the great settled civilizations, trading with some, raiding others, and leaving behind a remarkable amount of evidence of how they lived, in the form of frozen burials in the permafrost. The permafrost, like the glacier that preserved Ötzi, is extraordinarily good at keeping things intact. And among the things it has kept intact for us are skin, tattooed skin. The Pazyryk culture, which we will discuss more in the next chapter, is perhaps the most famous example of tattooed steppe nomads, but they are far from alone. Across the Tarim Basin in what is now Western China, researchers have found mummies of people who were not ethnically Chinese, the so-called Tarim mummies, some of whom appear to have had European or at least Western Eurasian ancestry, and who are buried with remarkable textiles, wooden artifacts, and in some cases, tattoos. The Churchen Man, a particularly well-preserved mummy from this region dating to around 1000 BCE, shows tattoos on his face, sun symbols possibly, or spiral patterns, that connect to a broader tradition of facial tattooing among steppe peoples. In China proper, tattooing has a complicated history, one that oscillates between acceptance and stigma in ways that track the shifting values of Chinese civilization across thousands of years. The earliest Chinese written references to tattooing are not flattering. In ancient Chinese texts, tattooing is frequently associated with barbarians, that is, non-Chinese peoples, the nomads of the steppes and the hill peoples of the south and west, who did not share the Confucian values of the Chinese court. The Chinese ideograph for barbarian sometimes incorporated elements referencing tattooing or body marking, reinforcing the idea that to be tattooed was to be uncivilized, to be other. But And this is important. Tattooing also appeared within China itself, specifically as a form of punishment. Criminals in ancient and medieval China could be tattooed on the face as a permanent mark of their transgression. This was one of the 5 punishments in some classical Chinese legal systems, known as qing. Facial tattooing that marked the wearer as someone who had violated the social order. The visibility of the mark was the point. You could not hide it. It followed you everywhere. It told everyone you met before you had said a single word that you had done something wrong. This use of tattooing as punishment, as a mark of shame and exclusion rather than honour and belonging, is a theme that will appear in many cultures throughout history, and it represents one of the fundamental tensions in the entire history of tattooing. The same practice, the same act of putting permanent marks on skin can mean radically different things depending on the context. In one culture, a tattoo is a mark of spiritual protection. In another, it is a mark of criminal transgression. In one social stratum, it is a symbol of high status and belonging. In another, it is a mark of the lowest and most marginalized members of society. Tattooing does not have a fixed meaning. It never has. Its meaning is always assigned by the people doing it and the people seeing it within a specific cultural moment. In China, this tension played out across millennia. There were periods and regions where tattooing was practiced by specific groups. Fishermen, for example, who tattooed their bodies with patterns believed to protect them at sea, to make them look frightening to sea creatures, or to help identify their bodies if they drowned. Warriors in some traditions tattooed themselves as marks of courage or military achievement. But the overarching Confucian ethic, which placed enormous value on the integrity of the body as a gift from one's ancestors, to be kept whole and unmodified out of filial piety, made tattooing broadly suspicious in elite Chinese culture. This ethic had an interesting and consequential knock-on effect. Among the cultures that adopted Chinese civilization as a model, including, most significantly, Japan and Korea, the Confucian attitude toward body modification became deeply embedded. In Japan, this created a fascinating dynamic. Tattooing was, at various points in history, associated with criminals, as it was used as a punishment mark, then adopted defiantly by the working classes and criminal underworld, then evolved into one of the most sophisticated and aesthetically complex tattooing traditions in the world. We will get to Japan in considerable detail later. For now, it is enough to note that China's ambivalent relationship with tattooing sent ripples outward through the cultures it influenced, shaping the meaning of the practice in ways that are still felt today. The Silk Road deserves a specific mention here, because it was not just a road for silk, it was a road for everything. Goods, yes, but also ideas, technologies, religions, diseases, and people. The tattooed peoples of the steppes, the Scythians, the Sarmatians, the Pazyryk people, the various Turkic and Mongol groups, moved along these routes or lived adjacent to them. Their practices, their aesthetic traditions, their ways of understanding what a mark on the body meant, travelled with them. Merchants and travellers from China, Persia, India, Greece and Rome moved along these routes and encountered tattooed peoples, carried back stories about them, and sometimes, perhaps, carried back the practice itself. The Silk Road is, among other things, a story about how human beings have always been in contact with each other across vast distances, exchanging not just goods but ways of being human. Tattooing is one of those ways. Chapter 4: The Scythians and Pazyryk. The most spectacular ancient tattoos ever found you are on the Eurasian steppe. The landscape stretches in every direction with the flat, windswept indifference of a place that has no particular interest in human beings. There are horses, there are always horses here, and there are wagons, and there are felt tents, and there are people who have been riding since they could walk, and who regard settled civilization with the politely disguised contempt of people who are not sure that walls and fields represent an improvement over freedom and open sky. You are most likely a Scythian, or perhaps a member of the closely related Pazyryk culture. The distinction would have been obvious to you, and is somewhat academic to us. You live somewhere in the vast arc of territory that stretches from the Black Sea in the west to the Altai Mountains in the east, and you are, by the standards of the settled civilizations around you, extraordinarily well-travelled. Your people trade with the Greeks on the Black Sea coast, with the Persians to the south, with the Chinese to the east. You are not a backwater, you are a hub, and you are covered in tattoos, We know this because of the prehistoric burials. The prehistoric were a group of Iron Age nomads who lived in the Altai Mountains of what is now southern Siberia and northern Mongolia, roughly between 600 and 300 BCE. Their burial practices involved placing the deceased in large wooden chambers beneath earthen mounds, kurgans, and in a number of cases the permafrost beneath these mounds preserved the bodies in extraordinary condition. Not just the bones, the actual bodies, with the skin intact, and on that skin, tattoos. The most spectacular, most complex, most aesthetically sophisticated tattoos that have been found anywhere in the ancient world. The most famous of the prehistoric tattooed individuals is a man known today as the prehistoric chieftain, or sometimes simply as the Altai man, found in a kurgan at prehistoric in 1948 by the Soviet archaeologist Sergei Rudenko. His body was covered with a menagerie of animals rendered in a swirling, dynamic style that art historians immediately recognized as related to the animal style. The distinctive aesthetic tradition of the Eurasian steppes, characterized by twisting, interlocking animal figures, often depicted mid-movement, with a remarkable sense of energy and motion. On his arms and torso, a procession of fantastical creatures. A donkey, a deer with elaborately stylized antlers, a ram, a mountain goat, two creatures that appear to be some kind of hybrid beast, and fish along his spine. The artistry of these tattoos cannot be overstated. These are not simple geometric marks or rows of dots. These are sophisticated, detailed compositions, executed with clear aesthetic intention and remarkable technical skill. The lines are confident and precise. The figures have movement and personality. These are the work of someone, or multiple someones, who knew exactly what they were doing, who had been doing this for a long time, who were operating within a well-developed artistic tradition. Then, in 1993, something even more remarkable was discovered. A female mummy, the woman who would become known as the Altai Princess, or the Ice Maiden of Ukok, was found on the Ukok Plateau in the Russian Altai, in a kurgan that had been sealed by permafrost for approximately 2,500 years. She was in her mid-20s when she died, and she was buried with remarkable care, with 6 horses, an elaborate headdress, a small table with food, and her own clothing, which included a silk blouse that suggested she was a woman of high status. And she had tattoos. On her left shoulder, a deer with antlers that curl and branch in the exuberant stylized manner characteristic of the prehistoric animal style. On her wrist, what appeared to be the head and paw of a griffin. On her thumb, a simplified animal figure. These tattoos, like the chieftain's, are executed with extraordinary skill. Fine lines, complex compositions, clearly the work of an experienced hand. Who was she? This question has been the subject of considerable discussion, and not just academic discussion. The local indigenous people of the Altai region, the prehistoric's cultural descendants, consider her an ancestral figure and have strongly and repeatedly requested her repatriation. For them, she is not a specimen to be studied. She is a relative. Her name, in their tradition, is Ochibala, a warrior princess. Her return has been a matter of ongoing negotiation between the indigenous community and the Russian authorities who have held her remains. This situation is a reminder that the ancient people we study through the lens of archaeology were not simply artifacts. They were people with descendants, with communities that remember them, with stories about them that have survived in oral tradition even when the physical body has been locked in permafrost for 2,500 years. The tattoos on the Ice Maiden's arm are not just evidence of ancient tattooing practice. They are part of a living cultural heritage. The Scythians, the wider cultural group of which the prehistoric were a part, were well known to the ancient Greeks, and the Greeks wrote about them extensively. Herodotus, the 5th century BCE Greek historian who is sometimes called the father of history, and sometimes called the father of lies, depending on how charitable you're feeling, wrote about the Scythians with a mixture of fascination and horror that was the standard Greek response to barbarian peoples. He noted that the Scythians tattooed, and he noted this as a distinguishing characteristic, something that marked them as different from the Greeks, as other. But here is an interesting complication. The Greeks also tattooed, and we will get to that in the next chapter. For now, let us sit with the prehistoric for a moment longer. Because what their tattoos tell us, beyond the specifics of their artistic tradition, is something important about the relationship between tattooing and social identity in nomadic cultures. When you do not have fixed architecture, when you do not have temples or palaces or city walls to proclaim your status, your affiliation, your beliefs, the body itself becomes the architecture. The tattoos on a prehistoric warrior's arm are his history, his allegiance, his identity, made visible and permanent on the most portable of surfaces. You carry your identity with you, written in your skin, wherever the horses take you. This is not unique to the prehistoric. It is a pattern that appears in nomadic and semi-nomadic cultures around the world, from the Maori of New Zealand to the Inuit of the Arctic, cultures in which the body is the primary canvas for communicating who you are and where you belong. The permanence of tattooing is especially meaningful in this context, in a world where everything else moves: the camp, the herds, the seasons, the tattoo stays. Chapter 5: Ancient Greece and Rome. When tattoos meant something very different, you're in Athens. The year is something like 450 BCE, which puts us right in the middle of the classical period, the era of Pericles and Socrates and the Parthenon, the golden age of Greek civilization that Western culture has been referencing approvingly ever since. The city is full of marble and olive trees and philosophical arguments, and somewhere in it, people are being tattooed, but not in the way you might expect. For the ancient Greeks, tattooing had a specific and predominantly negative connotation. The Greek word for tattoo was stigma, a word that has come down to us in English in a form that has retained almost exactly its ancient meaning. A stigma was a mark, a brand, placed on the body of a person to indicate their status as someone outside the normal social order. Slaves were tattooed, often on the forehead or face, with marks identifying their owner or their origin. Criminals were tattooed. Prisoners of war were tattooed. The Athenians tattooed the Samian prisoners they took during the conflict between Athens and Samos in the 5th century BCE, an act considered so humiliating that the Samians retaliated by tattooing Athenian prisoners with an owl, the symbol of Athens. This is a significant cultural point. For the Greeks of the classical period, having a tattoo was, in most contexts, evidence that you were a slave, a criminal, or a prisoner. It was a mark of degradation, of having been claimed and marked by someone with power over you. The body of a free Greek citizen was supposed to be unmarked, whole, unbranded, belonging entirely to the citizen himself. This attitude was not universal in the Greek world. Thracians, a people living to the north of Greece who had significant cultural exchange with the Greeks, reportedly tattooed for reasons of status and beauty rather than punishment, and Greek sources note this with some surprise. And there were Greek religious contexts in which worshippers of certain cults, particularly the cult of the Thracian god Sabazios, marked themselves with religious tattoos. But in the mainstream of classical Greek culture, the tattoo as punishment mark was the dominant association. The Romans largely inherited the Greek attitude with some modifications. Roman law permitted the tattooing of slaves and criminals, and Roman soldiers were sometimes tattooed, though there is debate about whether this was a standard practice or how widespread it was. The Emperor Constantine, after he converted to Christianity in the 4th century CE, banned the tattooing of faces, on the grounds that the human face was made in the image of God and should not be disfigured, but permitted tattooing on the hands and legs. Roman soldiers, interestingly, appear to have sometimes tattooed themselves voluntarily, particularly with the name or symbol of their unit, an early version of the military tattoo tradition that continues to this day. This is a different context from the stigma of slavery or criminal punishment. This is the tattoo as a mark of voluntary membership, of group identity, of loyalty. The same practice, but with a completely different meaning. Here we see, again, the fundamental ambiguity of tattooing as a cultural practice. In the same civilization, at the same time, a tattoo can mean I am a slave and I am a soldier who's proud of my unit. The mark itself is neutral. It is the context that gives it meaning. One more Roman connection is worth noting before we move on. The Romans encountered tattooed people wherever they expanded their empire, and they encountered them with a mixture of fascination and distaste that mirrors the Greek reaction to the Thracians and Scythians. When Julius Caesar and subsequent Roman commanders led campaigns into Britain, they encountered the Britons and the Picts, peoples who, according to Roman accounts, decorated their bodies with elaborate blue markings, using a plant called woad as the pigment. The Roman historian Herodian, writing in the 3rd century CE, described the Picts as tattooing their bodies with pictures of animals. The name Pict itself may derive from the Latin picti, meaning painted or marked ones. Were the Picts and Britons actually tattooed, or were they painted? This is a question that historians have debated for a long time, and the honest answer is, we don't know for certain. The Roman sources use language that could refer to either tattooing or painting, and the distinction may not have been entirely clear to Roman writers who didn't necessarily have close personal familiarity with the practice. What is clear is that elaborate body marking was an important part of these northern European cultures, marking them, in Roman eyes, as definitively barbarian, definitively other, definitively not Roman. And yet the Romans tattooed too, just for different reasons, in different contexts, with different meanings. As always, with tattooing, the meaning is everything. Chapter 6. The Pacific. Polynesia and the birthplace of the word tattoo. You are on a canoe, a large one, double-hulled, designed for open ocean sailing, equipped with a crab-claw sail that catches the trade winds with remarkable efficiency. Around you, the Pacific Ocean extends in every direction, blue and enormous, and to a European observer terrifyingly empty. But you're not a European observer. You're a Polynesian navigator, and this ocean is not empty to you. You know it the way a person knows a familiar landscape, by its currents, its swells, its stars, its birds, the particular smell of the air in different regions, the colour of the water above different depths. You have charts of a kind that Europeans will not understand when they first encounter them. Stick charts made of wood and shell, maps of wave patterns rather than coastlines. You are, in the broadest sense, one of the most extraordinary seafarers in human history. The Polynesian people colonized the Pacific Ocean, the largest geographic feature on the surface of the Earth, in a series of migrations beginning around 1500 BCE and continuing for roughly 3,000 years. They settled Hawaii, New Zealand, Easter Island, Samoa, Tonga, the Marquesas, Tahiti, and hundreds of other islands, navigating thousands of miles of open ocean in vessels that European naval commanders of a later era would regard with polite skepticism. And everywhere they went, they brought their tattoo traditions with them. Polynesian tattooing is, in the estimation of many tattoo historians, one of the most sophisticated and culturally significant tattooing traditions in human history. It is also, somewhat ironically, the source of the word tattoo itself. The English word that has become the global term for the practice comes from the Tahitian word tato, or the Samoan word tatau, which means something like to strike or to mark, and which was recorded by the crew of Captain James Cook during his first Pacific voyage in 1769. Before we get to Cook, let us spend some time with the tradition itself. Polynesian tattooing is not one thing. It is a family of related traditions, each developed on a specific island or island group, each with its own aesthetic conventions, its own symbolic vocabulary, its own relationship to social structure and spiritual belief. The Maori tradition of tamoko, facial tattooing, is probably the most recognizable to contemporary Western audiences, but it is one tradition among many. In the Marquesas Islands, tattooing reached a level of coverage that astonished European observers when they first arrived. High-status Marquesan men could be tattooed over virtually their entire bodies, from the face down to the feet, in patterns of extraordinary intricacy. The designs were geometric, spirals, chevrons, repeated geometric units, but densely packed and precisely executed, creating an effect that one early European observer described as looking like fine lacework on the skin. Marquesan tattooing was not merely decorative, it was a record, a visual biography of the person's life, their lineage, their achievements, their spiritual status. To read a Marquesan tattoo, if you knew the symbolic vocabulary, was to read a person's history. In Samoa, the tradition of pea, the traditional male tattoo that covers the body from the waist to the knees, has survived to the present day and is still practiced in its traditional form. The pea is applied using a comb-like tool made from boar's tusk, attached to a handle and struck with a mallet, a technique that is physically demanding to the point of being genuinely painful, and which is understood as a test of fortitude as much as a form of decoration. The process takes multiple sessions over several days, and the pain is considered part of the meaning. To endure the pea with dignity is to demonstrate that you are worthy of the status it confers. This is another recurring theme in the history of tattooing. Pain as a meaningful part of the process, not incidental to it, not a regrettable side effect, but part of what the tattoo means. In many cultures, the willingness and ability to endure the pain of tattooing is itself a form of communication. It says something about character, about courage, about the seriousness with which you take the commitment you're making. The modern tattoo studio has in many ways worked to minimise pain. Better needles, better technique, numbing creams. But in many traditional tattooing cultures, minimising the pain would be missing the point. The Maori tradition of tamoko is perhaps the most visually distinctive of all Polynesian tattooing practices. Tamoko are applied to the face, and traditionally primarily to the faces of men of high status, though women also received moko, typically on the chin and lips. The designs are not generic. Each tamoko is unique to the individual, encoding their specific genealogy, their tribal affiliation, their rank, their achievements. Two people with the same tamoko would be as unthinkable as two people with the same fingerprint. The design is yours. It is the visual representation of who you specifically are, in the most precise possible terms. Maori warriors used their tiamoko as a kind of identification document, and they understood its permanence in a very literal way. In the early 19th century, when European traders arrived in New Zealand and showed an interest in purchasing Maori artifacts, some Maori warriors would draw their tamoko on paper and use it as a signature on documents, a practice that has no equivalent in any other culture. The tattoo as literally the self, as the unique identifier, as the signature on a document. It is a remarkable expression of how deeply the Maori understood the relationship between the tattoo and personal identity. The spiritual dimension of Polynesian tattooing is also significant. In many Polynesian cultures, the process of tattooing was surrounded by ritual and religious observance. The tattooist was often a figure of spiritual power. The session was conducted under specific protocols. The designs incorporated symbols with sacred meaning. Tattooing was not something you did lightly, as a fashion choice. It was something you undertook with the understanding that you were engaging with forces larger than yourself, that the marks you received carried spiritual weight and obligation. When Captain Cook and his crew arrived in Tahiti in 1769, they were not the first Europeans to encounter Polynesian tattooing. Spanish and Portuguese sailors had encountered it earlier. But Cook's voyages produced the most systematic and influential documentation of it. The naturalist Joseph Banks, who accompanied Cook, wrote detailed observations of Tahitian tattooing, and crew members, including Cook himself, it is sometimes claimed, though the evidence for this specific claim is debated, returned to Europe bearing tattoos. The sailors who returned from Cook's voyages tattooed were, in a sense, the origin point of the modern Western tattoo tradition. They brought the practice back to European port cities, where it spread among the maritime working class, first sailors, then dockers, then other working class men. The word tattoo entered the English language from these voyages. The practice entered Western culture through these sailors. It is one of the great ironies of tattoo history that a practice which had existed in Europe for millennia, the Romans tattooed, the Britons and Picts marked their bodies, medieval European pilgrims tattooed themselves with crosses in the Holy Land, was effectively reintroduced to European popular culture from the Pacific via the voyages of exploration. The practice had been there all along, but it needed the Polynesians and the sailors who came home from their islands to make it something that Europeans would actually do voluntarily, for reasons of identity and belonging rather than punishment and shame. Chapter 7. Japan. From Criminal Mark to Living Art. Yorinido. The year is somewhere in the early 18th century, and the city, which will one day be renamed Tokyo and become one of the largest urban centres on the planet, is already enormous, already teeming, already a place of extraordinary cultural vitality and rigid social hierarchy existing in uneasy proximity to each other. The streets are crowded with merchants, craftsmen, labourers, samurai, monks, entertainers and street food vendors, and the air smells of fish and wood smoke and the particular humidity of a city built on a river delta. Somewhere in this city, in a neighbourhood that the authorities would prefer to pretend does not exist, a man is being tattooed. Not quickly, not painlessly, and not for decorative reasons, at least not entirely. The man lying face down on the floor while a tattooist works on his back with a set of needles. Attached to a bamboo handle is a fireman, or a labourer, or possibly a member of one of the organisations that exist in the shadows of Edo society, the groups the authorities classify as criminal, but which have their own internal codes of loyalty and honour that their members consider more binding than any law handed down from the shogunate. The tattoo being applied to his back is enormous. It will take months to complete. When it is finished, it will cover his entire back, possibly extending down his arms, his legs, his chest, in a composition of extraordinary beauty and complexity. A dragon, perhaps, or a scene from a legend, or a mythological hero, rendered in a style that draws on the same aesthetic traditions as the woodblock prints that Japan is producing in this period in extraordinary quantities. It will be, in every meaningful sense of the word, a masterpiece, and its creation will have been agonizing, expensive, time-consuming, and, depending on exactly who this man is and what he does for a living, potentially illegal. Japan's relationship with tattooing is one of the most complex and fascinating in the entire history of the practice. To understand it, you need to understand two apparently contradictory facts. First, that Japan eventually developed one of the most sophisticated, technically accomplished, and aesthetically ambitious tattooing traditions in the world. Second, that for much of its history, the Japanese state regarded tattooing with a hostility that went as far as outright prohibition. These two facts are not contradictory. They are causally related. The prohibition, in large part, created the tradition. Let us start at the beginning. Evidence of tattooing in Japan goes back to the Yomon period, the Neolithic era of Japanese prehistory, roughly 14,000 to 300 BCE. Clay figurines from this period show markings on the face and body that many researchers interpret as representations of tattoos. These were not the tattoos of criminals or outlaws. They appear to have been marks of status, spirituality, or identity, in line with the general pattern of tattooing in prehistoric and ancient cultures worldwide. As Japanese civilization developed and came increasingly under the influence of Chinese culture, including, as we noted earlier, the Confucian attitude toward body modification, tattooing began to acquire negative connotations. By the Kofun period, roughly 300 to 600 CE, Chinese accounts of Japan were already noting that the Japanese used tattoos to mark criminals. This practice continued and became formalized in subsequent centuries. Specific crimes were punished with specific tattoo marks, typically applied to the face or arm, that permanently identified the bearer as someone who had transgressed against the social order. In the Edo period, 1603 to 1868, this punitive tattooing was systematized under the Tokugawa shogunate. Different regions had different systems. In some areas, a first offense might be marked with a single line on the arm, a second offense with another line, a third with a mark that completed a character meaning criminal or dog. The tattoo is a cumulative record of transgression, building up on the skin over a lifetime of encounters with the law. But here is where the story gets interesting. Because it was precisely in the Edo period, the era of systematic punitive tattooing, that Japan's extraordinary tradition of decorative and artistic tattooing, known as irezumi, began to flourish, and it flourished, at least in part, among exactly the people who had already been marked by punitive tattoos. The logic is not difficult to follow. If you have been marked by the state as a criminal, if you carry on your skin a permanent sign of your exclusion from respectable society, then one response is to cover that mark, not to hide it exactly, but to transform it, to take the mark that was imposed on you and incorporate it into something larger, something that you chose, something that expresses not your degradation but your identity, your affiliation, your aesthetic sensibility, your courage. The criminal tattoo becomes the foundation of an artistic tattoo. The stigma becomes a canvas. This pattern of marginalized groups transforming a mark of shame into a mark of identity and belonging is one that we will see again in other cultures and other eras. It is one of the most consistently recurring patterns in the entire history of tattooing. The Edo period also saw another population embrace irezumi, the workers, specifically the firemen, construction workers, and labourers who formed the backbone of Edo's urban economy. These men, often working in physically demanding, dangerous conditions, began adopting full-body tattoos as a form of identity, solidarity, and in the case of firemen, possibly a kind of spiritual protection. The firemen of Edo, who were organised into competing companies with fierce rivalries and strong internal loyalties, were particularly associated with irezumi, and the practice of full-body tattooing became a marker of working-class masculine identity in a way that paralleled, in some respects, the role of tattooing in other working-class traditions around the world. What made irezumi distinct, what elevated it in the eyes of many to the level of high art, was the involvement of professional artists with backgrounds in other visual arts. The masters of ukiyo-e, the woodblock print tradition that was producing some of the most visually sophisticated artwork in the world during this period, brought their compositional sensibility, their mastery of colour and line, their knowledge of the visual traditions of Japanese mythology and legend to the skin. The result was tattoos conceived as complete artistic compositions, not collections of individual images, but unified wholes designed to work with the body's curves and contours, to move when the person moved, to tell a coherent story across the entire surface of the back and arms and legs. The influence of ukiyo-e on Irezumi is direct and traceable. Many of the classic Irezumi motifs, the dragon, the koi fish, the phoenix, the Buddhist deity Fudo-Mai-o-o, the heroes of the Chinese novel Suikoden, come directly from woodblock print imagery. The Suikoden connection is particularly significant. A Japanese translation of this Chinese novel, published in the 1820s with illustrations by the master artist Utagawa Kuniyoshi depicting tattooed heroes, became enormously popular and is credited by many historians with sparking a major surge of interest in decorative tattooing among the Edo working class. Men wanted to look like those heroes. The tattoo master became the means of achieving that. The tattoo masters of the Edo period developed technical innovations that would shape the practice for generations. The tabori technique, hand poking with a bundle of needles attached to a handle, allowed for a subtlety of shading and a gradation of colour that was not easily achievable with other methods. The use of multiple colours, red, blue, green, yellow, black, and the subtle gradations between them, allowed for compositions of extraordinary visual richness, and the understanding of how to design for the body, how to make a composition that works in 3 dimensions, that changes as the person turns and moves, was a knowledge accumulated over generations of practice. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration ended the Tokugawa shogunate and began Japan's rapid modernization and westernization. The new government, eager to present Japan as a civilized modern nation to Western audiences, banned tattooing in 1872. Irezumi went underground. It continued to be practiced, but covertly, among the working class and criminal underworld. Foreigners, interestingly, were exempt from the ban, which led to a curious situation in which Irezumi masters were patronized by Western tourists and dignitaries, including, famously, members of European royal families who visited Japan and came home with Japanese tattoos. The ban was lifted in 1948 after World War II, under pressure from the American occupation authorities. But the association between tattooing and the Yakuza, the Japanese organized crime network, which had adopted Irezumi as a badge of membership, meant that social stigma around tattoos persisted in Japan long after the legal prohibition ended. In Japan today, tattoos are still banned in many public bathhouses and gyms. The Irezumi tradition is simultaneously recognized internationally as one of the great artistic achievements of tattoo history, and regarded with deep suspicion within Japan itself. It is a complicated legacy. But it is also a remarkably coherent one. Tattooing in Japan has always existed in tension with authority, always been associated with people who exist at the edges of the social order, always been a practice that carries the weight of that outsider status even as it achieves extraordinary things aesthetically. The tension is not a bug, it may be the source. Chapter 8. The Americas. Ink across 2 continents. You're in the Andes. The altitude is making your head hurt. You're somewhere above 3,000 meters, and the air at this elevation has roughly the same relationship to the air at sea level as a polite suggestion has to a direct command. But you're not going anywhere, because you live here, and you have been living here, in this thin and dazzling air for a very long time. You're a member of one of the pre-Columbian cultures of South America, and you are tattooed, or painted, or scarified, or some combination of all 3, because body modification in the Americas is not one thing. It is a vast and varied landscape of practices, meanings, and traditions that stretches from the frozen south of Tierra del Fuego to the Arctic north of Canada, encompassing hundreds of distinct cultures with hundreds of distinct relationships to the marked body. Let us start with the archaeological evidence, because the Americas, like the rest of the world, have given us physical proof of ancient tattooing in the most direct form possible. Tattooed mummies. The driest desert in the world, the Atacama, runs along the Pacific coast of South America, through parts of what are now Peru and Chile, and its extraordinary aridity has preserved organic materials for thousands of years. Among those materials, human bodies, and among those bodies, tattooed ones. The Chinchorro mummies of northern Chile and southern Peru, which include some of the oldest artificially mummified human remains in the world, predating the Egyptian mummy tradition by 2,000 years, include individuals with markings on their skin. Whether these are tattoos or post-mortem markings applied as part of the mummification process is debated, but the evidence for intentional tattooing in the region becomes clearer in later periods. The Chiribaya culture, which flourished in the coastal regions of what is now southern Peru between roughly 900 and 1350 CE, has provided some of the most striking evidence of tattooing in ancient South America. Chiribaya mummies have been found with tattoos on their hands, wrists, ankles and feet, geometric designs, birds, monkeys and other figurative imagery, applied with considerable skill. The placement of some of these tattoos on the hands and feet is interesting. These are areas of the body that would have been visible in normal dress, suggesting that visibility was part of the point, that these markings were meant to be seen. In North America, the evidence for ancient tattooing is more fragmentary but still substantial. The Mississippian culture, which flourished in the central and eastern portions of North America between roughly 800 and 1600 CE, left behind artistic representations, engraved on shell, carved in stone, depicted in ceramics, of human figures with elaborate markings on their skin. Whether these represent tattoos specifically, or painted designs, or some combination, is difficult to determine from artistic representations alone. But body marking of some kind appears to have been an important part of Mississippian ceremonial and social life. Among the historic period Native American cultures of North America, the cultures encountered and documented by European observers from the 16th century onward, tattooing was widespread. Different nations had different traditions, different meanings, different practices. Among the Iroquois nations of the northeastern woodlands, tattooing was practiced and observed by early French missionaries who recorded it with varying degrees of accuracy and objectivity. Among the Plains nations, both tattooing and body painting were practiced, with different occasions and different meanings assigned to each. Among the nations of the Pacific Northwest, tattooing was associated with status and spiritual power. The Inuit and related peoples of the Arctic deserve specific mention because their tattooing traditions, particularly among Inuit women, are among the most distinctive and most recent to be studied in depth. Inuit women were traditionally tattooed on the face, chin, and sometimes the hands and arms, with designs that encoded information about their identity, their marital status, their achievements. The chin tattoo, in Nia particular, was and is a mark of womanhood and identity in many Inuit and Yupik cultures. The tradition was suppressed by Christian missionaries in the 19th and 20th centuries, along with many other aspects of indigenous culture, but has been undergoing a significant revival in recent decades, with indigenous women reclaiming the practice as an act of cultural reconnection and self-determination. This revival is happening not just in the Arctic. Across North America, indigenous tattooing traditions that were suppressed by colonization and missionary activity are being reclaimed, revived, and practiced again. The Haudenosaunee, the Ojibwe, the Coast Salish, the Hawaiian practitioners of cacao, all are part of a broader movement of cultural recovery that understands traditional tattooing not as a quaint historical practice, but as a living expression of identity, spirituality, and resistance. We should also spend some time in Mesoamerica, because the great civilizations of Mexico and Central America had their own complex relationships with body marking. The Maya tattooed, we know this from their own art, which depicts figures with elaborate markings on their skin, and from the accounts of Spanish conquistadors and missionaries who encountered tattooed Maya in the 16th century. Spanish accounts describe Maya tattooing as widespread among both men and women, with designs covering the face and body, and note, with the particular distaste of Catholic missionaries encountering what they considered pagan practices, that the Maya regarded their tattoos as marks of bravery and beauty. The Aztec likewise tattooed, and the context is particularly interesting because Aztec tattooing appears to have been closely tied to religious practice. Specific tattoos were associated with specific deities. Worshippers of particular gods marked themselves with that god's symbols. Children dedicated to specific deities might be tattooed as part of the dedication ritual. Warriors who achieved specific feats in battle received specific tattoo marks acknowledging those achievements. The tattoo in Aztec culture was a record of divine allegiance and martial achievement simultaneously. the Spanish destruction of indigenous cultures in the Americas, the burning of books, the suppression of religious practices, the forced conversion to Christianity, included the active suppression of tattooing. Missionaries regarded the tattoos of the people they were trying to convert as devil's marks, as signs of paganism, as evidence of the spiritual darkness that Christianity was supposed to illuminate. The tattoos were not just decoration, in the missionary view. They were evidence of allegiance to the wrong powers. They had to go. Of course, you cannot make an existing tattoo go away, but you can prevent people from getting new ones through a combination of religious pressure, social stigma, and outright prohibition. And over the generations, as indigenous communities were disrupted, dispersed, and subjected to sustained pressure to assimilate, many tattooing traditions were lost. The knowledge of the designs, the meanings, the rituals surrounding them, the techniques for making them. Not entirely lost. Traditions survive in fragments, in descriptions written by outsiders, in objects, in oral accounts, but damaged, interrupted. The revival of these traditions today is an act of reconstruction as much as continuation. It requires research, consultation with elders, careful interpretation of historical sources, and creative decisions about how to adapt ancient practices to the present. It is difficult, important work, and it is happening in communities across the Americas and beyond. Chapter 9. The Middle Ages, Pilgrims, Crusaders, and the Christian Tattoo. You're on a road. It is dusty and long and your feet hurt, which is entirely appropriate, because you are a medieval pilgrim, and your feet are going to hurt for the next several weeks at minimum. You are walking, along with anywhere from a handful to several hundred other people, depending on the route and the season, toward a sacred site. It might be the shrine of St. James at Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. It might be the tomb of Thomas Becket at Canterbury. It might be, most ambitiously of all, Jerusalem itself. You are on pilgrimage, and depending on where you're going and what century you're doing it in, there is a reasonable chance that you will come home with a tattoo. The medieval Christian tattoo tradition is one of the least known chapters in the history of tattooing, partly because it fits awkwardly with the common assumption that Christianity was uniformly hostile to tattooing. This assumption is not entirely wrong. There are passages in the Old Testament, most notably Leviticus 19:28, which prohibits putting marks on the body in the context of mourning rituals for the dead, that were cited by various church authorities as grounds for opposing tattooing. But the relationship between Christianity and tattooing is considerably more complicated than a simple prohibition. In the early Christian period, some Christians tattooed themselves with Christian symbols, crosses, the Chi-Rho symbol, fish, as marks of faith. Whether this was understood as analogous to the devotional tattooing of pagan traditions or as something distinct is difficult to say. What is clear is that it happened, and that it was not universally condemned. Some early Christian writers, interpreting the passage from Galatians in which Paul writes that he bears the marks of Jesus on his body, understood this metaphorically. Others understood it, or at least found sympathetic to, a literal interpretation. The pilgrim tattoo tradition is well documented, particularly in the context of pilgrimages to Jerusalem. From at least the medieval period onward, Christian pilgrims who made the arduous journey to the Holy Land would sometimes receive tattoos, typically crosses, or the image of the Holy City, or the name of Jerusalem, as a permanent souvenir of their journey. This tradition was provided in the Jerusalem context by a specific family of Coptic Christian tattooists who held a hereditary monopoly on the practice. The Razouk family, whose tattooing practice in Jerusalem dates back centuries, is still operating today, making it, by some measures, the oldest continuously operating tattoo practice in the world. The pilgrimage tattoo served a specific function. It was proof. In the medieval world, where the journey to Jerusalem could take years and cost everything a person had, returning with a tattoo was a way of demonstrating that you had actually made it. You had been there. You had stood in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. You had touched the stones of the places where the most important events in Christian history had occurred, and you had the mark to prove it. Permanent, unfalsifiable, written into your skin. There is something deeply human about this. The desire to mark an important experience on the body, to turn an internal event into an external, visible, permanent sign, is one of the most consistent motivations for tattooing across all cultures and all eras. The pilgrimage tattoo is the medieval version of the person who gets a tattoo to commemorate a significant moment in their life. a recovery, a loss, a journey, a transformation. The specific content is different. The impulse is identical. The Crusades added another dimension to the European encounter with tattooing in the Holy Land. Crusaders, soldiers as well as pilgrims, encountered tattooed peoples throughout the Middle East and the Mediterranean. They encountered the Coptic and Eastern Christian traditions of devotional tattooing. Some of them received tattoos themselves, and they brought these practices and their attendant stories back to Europe. There is also documentation of tattooing practices among certain European groups during the medieval period that has nothing to do with pilgrimage. Sailors tattooed, the maritime tattooing tradition that we will discuss more fully in a later chapter, has its roots in this period, though it flowered more fully in the early modern era. Some criminal marking was practiced in various European jurisdictions, echoing the Roman and Greek use of tattooing as punishment. And there are accounts from various parts of Europe of tattooing practices among specific communities, tinkers, travellers, certain craft guilds, that suggest the practice never entirely disappeared from European culture during the medieval period, even as the mainstream church's attitude toward it remained ambivalent. What the medieval period did not have, and what distinguishes it from both the ancient world and the modern era, is a broad, culturally sanctioned tradition of voluntary decorative tattooing among the general population. Tattooing in medieval Europe existed in the margins, among pilgrims marking a sacred journey, among sailors marking their trade, among criminals marked by law, among specific cultural subgroups maintaining their own traditions. The mainstream was largely unmarked. This would begin to change in the early modern period, as European exploration brought Europeans into sustained contact with tattooing cultures around the world, and as the stories, and eventually the practice itself, filtered back into European popular culture. But that change would take centuries, and it would come, as we have already touched on, through a specific and unlikely route: the Pacific Ocean, the voyages of Captain Cook, and the sailors who came home from Tahiti with tattoos and stories. Chapter 10: The Age of Sail: Sailors, Souvenirs, and the Spread of Tattooing in the Western World. You're on a ship, a large one, relatively speaking, though by modern standards it is astonishingly small to be crossing an ocean in, which it is doing somewhat unwillingly, as the weather has taken a turn. The ship smells of salt water and tar and the particular combination of close-quartered human beings that you get when you put several dozen men in a wooden box for 6 months and tell them to sail across the Pacific. You have been at sea for what feels like a very long time, and you are about to arrive somewhere extraordinary. You are a sailor in the era of European exploration, 16th, 17th, 18th century, take your pick, and you are about to encounter tattooed people. Depending on where exactly you're going, this encounter may be in the Caribbean, in West Africa, in the Indian Ocean, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific. The specifics differ. The basic experience is similar. You arrive somewhere, you see people with markings on their skin, and you are simultaneously fascinated and confused, because nothing in your European background has prepared you for this. European sailors of the Age of Sail were, collectively, one of the most important vectors for the global spread of tattooing practices. Not because they brought tattooing to places that didn't have it. They didn't, since virtually everywhere they went already had some form of body marking, but because they took tattooing home. They received tattoos in the ports and islands where they traded, and they returned to European port cities, London, Amsterdam, Lisbon, Bristol, Marseille, carrying those tattoos with them. Other sailors saw them, asked about them, and sometimes wanted their own, and a tradition began to grow. The specific catalyst that most historians point to is, as we have already mentioned, the voyages of Captain James Cook between 1768 and 1779. Cook's 3 Pacific voyages were among the most significant episodes of European exploration. They resulted in European knowledge of the Pacific that was simply unprecedented in its scope and detail, and they produced, among other things, the first sustained, systematic, written documentation of Polynesian tattooing by European observers. Joseph Banks, the naturalist on Cook's first voyage, wrote about Tahitian tattooing in his journals with a mixture of scientific detachment and genuine aesthetic appreciation. He described the designs, the tools, the process, and the social meanings attached to the practice with more care and more respect than most European observers of the era brought to indigenous practices. Banks himself was offered the opportunity to be tattooed, and the evidence suggests he may have accepted, at least partially, he certainly regarded it as a significant and meaningful cultural practice rather than mere barbarism. The sailors who returned from Cook's voyages tattooed were entering a specific social world, the world of the European maritime working class. This was a world with its own culture, its own hierarchy, its own traditions and superstitions, and its own aesthetic. It was a world where men spent months away from home, in close quarters, doing physically dangerous work, and where the markers of identity and belonging were correspondingly important. The tattoo fit into this world with remarkable ease. Maritime tattooing developed its own specific vocabulary of images that had specific meanings within the sailor community, and that accumulated into a kind of symbolic language. The anchor signifying that a sailor had crossed the Atlantic, the swallow traditionally earned after sailing 5,000 miles, and then 10,000 for the second swallow. The compass rose for finding your way home, the ship itself in full sail for a sailor who had rounded Cape Horn, the pig tattooed on one foot and the rooster on the other, because both animals were kept in wooden crates aboard ship and were said to be the only survivors of shipwrecks, a superstitious protection against drowning. The golden dragon for crossing the international date line, the shellback turtle for crossing the equator. These images were not randomly chosen. They were a system, a way of communicating experience and identity within a specific community. A sailor who could read these symbols could look at another sailor and immediately understand something about where he had been and what he had done. The tattoo as resume, the tattoo as membership card. The ports where tattooing flourished were also the ports where it spread. Sailors got tattooed in Tahiti and brought the practice to Portsmouth. They got tattooed in Japan and brought Japanese imagery to Rotterdam. They got tattooed in Hawaii and brought those designs to Liverpool. The maritime world was, by definition, a world in constant motion between cultures, and tattooing travelled with the sailors as surely as the goods in the hold. By the late 18th century, tattooing had become common enough among European and American sailors that it was unremarkable, a standard feature of maritime culture rather than an exotic curiosity. Naval records from this period sometimes recorded tattoos as identifying marks for sailors, a practical acknowledgement of the permanence of the practice. If a sailor deserted and was later captured, his tattoos could help identify him. The tattoo that was a mark of identity for the sailor became a tool of surveillance for the institution. In the early 19th century, tattooing began to spread from the maritime world into adjacent communities: dock workers, labourers, circus performers, and eventually the broader working class of European and American cities. This was a slow process, and for much of the 19th century, tattooing remained associated primarily with sailors, and, by extension, with a certain kind of rough, masculine working-class identity. Middle-class and upper-class Europeans did not generally tattoo. It was not their practice. It was the practice of the people at the docks. That would change, dramatically and somewhat unexpectedly, in the second half of the 19th century, and the change would come from an unlikely direction. Chapter 11. The Tattoo Machine and the Democratization of Ink. You are in New York City. The year is 1891. The city is enormous and chaotic and smells quite bad, as cities of this era tend to do, and it is experiencing a period of rapid change, economically, technologically, socially. The Industrial Revolution has been underway for decades, and its consequences, the mechanization of labour, the growth of cities, the acceleration of everything, are visible everywhere. On December the 8th, 1891, a man named Samuel O'Reilly files a patent in the United States for an electric tattooing machine. It is a relatively simple device, based on Thomas Edison's electric pen, which was itself a multi-needle device originally designed for stenciling, but its consequences for the history of tattooing are enormous. Before the electric tattoo machine, getting tattooed was a slow, laborious, expensive process. Whether using the hand-poke techniques of traditional cultures or the various manual instruments developed in European and American tattooing, the process required considerable time, considerable skill, and considerable tolerance for pain. The electric machine changed all of this. It was faster, significantly faster than hand methods. It was more consistent. It was, relatively speaking, less painful per unit of skin covered, and it reduced the technical barrier to tattooing considerably. The machine did much of the work that had previously required years of practice to develop manually. The result was a democratization of tattooing. a significant reduction in the cost, time, and technical barrier to getting tattooed. Tattoo studios began to proliferate in American and European cities, particularly in port cities and working-class neighbourhoods. Tattooing became accessible to a broader population, not just to sailors and those with access to traditional tattooing practices. But, and this is important, democratization cut in multiple directions. On one hand, it made tattooing available to more people. On the other, the reduction in cost and difficulty also reduced, in the eyes of some, the significance of the practice. If anyone could walk in off the street and pay a modest sum to emerge half an hour later with a tattoo, then the tattoo could no longer carry the same weight it had carried in traditions where the process was long, painful, expensive, and conducted within a specific ritual and social context. The machine made tattooing easier. It also made it, in some sense, cheaper, not just financially. This tension between accessibility and significance would run through the Western tattoo tradition for the next century and continues to be debated today. But in the immediate aftermath of O'Reilly's patent, the more pressing story was the rapid growth of a commercial tattooing industry in American and European cities. New York City, and specifically the Chatham Square neighborhood in Lower Manhattan, became the center of the early American tattooing industry. Chatham Square was a working-class neighborhood near the docks, full of sailors and laborers and people who had more enthusiasm for tattoos than anxiety about the social consequences of getting one. The tattoo parlors that proliferated here in the 1890s and early 1900s served this clientele, and also, increasingly, a curious middle-class and upper-class clientele who came downtown specifically to experience this exotic working-class practice. One of the most remarkable and least discussed episodes in the early history of American commercial tattooing is its brief flirtation with upper-class fashion. In the 1890s and early 1900s, tattooing became, somewhat improbably, fashionable among the European and American upper classes. British aristocrats were tattooed. Members of European royal families, we already mentioned those who visited Japan, received tattoos. Lady Randolph Churchill, mother of Winston Churchill, reportedly had a snake tattooed on her wrist. King Edward VII of England was tattooed. His sons, the Duke of Clarence and the Duke of York, later King George V, were tattooed during a visit to Japan as young naval officers. This aristocratic flirtation with tattooing was brief. By the early 20th century, the upper classes had largely abandoned the practice, leaving it to its more traditional constituencies: sailors, labourers, circus performers, and the criminal underworld. The tattoo returned to its working-class associations, where it would remain, at least in the mainstream cultural understanding, for the next several decades. The early tattoo artists of the American commercial tradition, figures like Charlie Wagner, Lou Alberts, and later Norman Collins, who worked under the name Sailor Jerry, were developing not just a trade but an aesthetic tradition. The flash sheets that hung on the walls of early tattoo parlors, standardized designs that customers could choose from, pre-drawn and ready to apply, established a visual vocabulary for American tattooing: eagles and anchors and hearts and roses and panthers and pin-up girls and sailing ships. These images drew on the maritime tradition, on folk art, on popular culture, on the imagery of circus sideshows and carnival barkers. They were bold, graphic, often quite beautiful in their directness and simplicity. They were also, by the standards of the world's tattooing traditions, fairly limited in scope and ambition. This was the tattooing tradition that would define American commercial tattooing through most of the 20th century, and it is the tradition against which the later developments of the tattoo renaissance, the explosion of styles, techniques, and artistic ambitions that began in the 1970s and accelerated dramatically in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, would define themselves. But we are getting ahead of the story. There is still much ground to cover. Chapter 12. The 20th Century. Soldiers, Outcasts, and the Slow Road to Respectability. You are in a military camp. The year is 1944, and the camp is somewhere in the Pacific Theatre, perhaps on one of the island chains that the American and Japanese militaries have been fighting over with a ferocity that would be difficult to overstate. The heat is oppressive, the mosquitoes are numerous and determined, and there are long stretches of waiting interrupted by brief, terrifying bursts of violence. You are a young American soldier, you are a long way from home, and you're about to get tattooed. Not because anyone told you to, not because it is required, but because the guy in the next bunk has one, and the guy in the bunk after that, and the tattoo artist who has set up a makeshift operation near the mess hall is charging $2 for a simple design, and it is something to do, and it feels important. Feels like a way of marking this moment, this experience, this fact of having been here and gone through this, in a way that will last longer than the photographs you are sending home. The role of the military in the history of Western tattooing cannot be overemphasized. Wars, particularly the major conflicts of the 20th century, World War I and World War II, were enormously significant in the spread of tattooing in American and European societies. Young men from all over the country, from backgrounds where tattooing was completely unknown and entirely foreign, found themselves thrown together in military service with men from port cities and working-class neighborhoods, where tattooing was already common. They encountered the practice. Many of them adopted it, and when they came home, they brought it with them. This pattern repeated with every major military conflict. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, each sent hundreds of thousands of young Americans into environments where tattooing was common, both among fellow servicemen and increasingly in the countries where they were stationed. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, all had tattooing traditions of their own, some ancient, some more recent, and American servicemen encountered these traditions and sometimes participated in them. The flow of influence was not one-directional. American servicemen were influenced by the tattooing traditions they encountered abroad, and the tattoo artists who worked these markets, particularly in Japan, where the post-war American military presence was massive and sustained, were influenced in turn by American tastes and preferences. The most significant figure in this transatlantic, trans-Pacific exchange is probably Norman Collins, who worked under the name Sailor Jerry. Collins was a tattooist based in Honolulu, Hawaii, who was active from the 1930s through the 1970s, and who occupies a position in American tattoo history that is difficult to overstate. He was technically brilliant, widely regarded as the finest American tattoo artist of his generation, and he was intellectually curious in a way that set him apart from most of his contemporaries. He studied Japanese tattooing seriously, corresponding with Japanese masters and incorporating elements of Japanese aesthetic tradition, the composition, the use of color, the integration of background elements, the sense of design as a unified whole, rather than a collection of individual images, into his work. The result was a synthesis, American imagery and subject matter rendered with Japanese compositional sophistication. Sailor Jerry's work was a bridge between the two great tattooing traditions of the 20th century, and it laid the groundwork for much of what was to come in the tattoo renaissance of the following decades. But before the Renaissance, there was the nadir. The 1950s and 1960s were, in many ways, a difficult period for tattooing in the United States. The association of tattoos with specific stigmatized populations, criminal gangs, prison inmates, carnival sideshow performers, was strong, and the mainstream cultural attitude toward tattooing was predominantly negative. In 1961, New York City banned tattooing entirely, ostensibly on public health grounds following a hepatitis outbreak linked to tattooing. The ban would remain in effect until 1997, 36 years during which tattooing was illegal in the city that had been its American commercial center. The health concerns were not entirely without basis. Tattooing, done with unsterilized equipment in unsanitary conditions, does carry real risks of infection and disease transmission. The practices of many tattoo shops in the mid-20th century would make a modern infection control specialist reach for the nearest available seat. The move towards sterile, technique, disposable needles, autoclaved equipment, single-use ink caps, gloves, has been one of the most significant developments in the professionalization of tattooing, and it did not happen overnight. The hepatitis concern was real. The response, outright prohibition, was arguably an overreaction, but it reflected the broader cultural attitude of the era. Tattooing was not a practice worth protecting. In prisons, however, tattooing flourished in conditions that were the precise opposite of sterile. Prison tattooing, done with improvised tools, sharpened staples, guitar strings, mechanical pencil components, improvised pigments, soot mixed with shampoo, melted plastic, and improvised machines, the motor from a cassette player rigged to drive a needle, developed its own aesthetic tradition, its own symbolic vocabulary, and its own social meanings. Prison tattoos communicated gang affiliation, criminal history, status within the prison hierarchy, and sometimes personal history and loss. They were made under conditions of surveillance and prohibition, which gave them an additional layer of meaning. The tattoo as defiance, as the assertion of identity in an environment specifically designed to strip identity away. The prison tattoo tradition fed back into the broader American tattooing culture in complex ways. The images and symbols developed in prison, teardrops, spiderwebs, 3 dots, specific gang insignia, became culturally legible outside of prison as markers of a specific experience and identity. They were sometimes adopted by people who had never been to prison as a form of aesthetic borrowing that was not always received well by the communities whose symbols they were appropriating, and the techniques of prison tattooing, improvised, rough, characteristically uneven in line quality, influenced some of the aesthetic developments in tattooing that would come later, including the deliberately rough and raw aesthetic sometimes called stick and poke, or hand poke. While all of this was happening in the United States, tattooing in other parts of the world was following its own trajectories. In Europe, tattooing remained a working-class practice, with a strong maritime component through most of the mid-20th century, concentrated in port cities and associated with specific subcultures. In Japan, as we noted, the post-war period saw tattooing continue its association with the Yakuza, while simultaneously beginning to attract interest from Western collectors and art world figures who recognized irezumi as a form of high art. In the Pacific Islands, traditional tattooing practices that had been suppressed by missionary and colonial activity were in various states of dormancy, survival, or early revival. The pivot, the moment when tattooing in the West began the long transition from stigmatized subculture practice to mainstream cultural phenomenon, is generally located in the late 1960s and 1970s, and it is associated with a specific group of artists who became known as the pioneers of the tattoo renaissance. Chapter 13. The Tattoo Renaissance. When ink became art, you're in San Francisco. The year's 1974, and the city is in the aftermath of a decade that changed it permanently. The summer of love, the rise of the counterculture, the sexual revolution, the anti-war movement, all of which happened here with particular intensity, leaving the city with a population that was more culturally experimental, more willing to question conventions, more open to the idea that things that had previously been considered low or marginal or disreputable might actually be interesting and valuable than almost any other city in America. Into this environment, a group of tattoo artists began doing something that the tattooing world had not quite done before, at least not in the Western commercial tradition. They began treating tattooing as fine art. The key figures of the tattoo renaissance are a relatively small group, and their names are worth knowing. Lyle Tuttle, whose flamboyant personality and high-profile clients, Janis Joplin, share, brought tattooing to mainstream media attention in the early 1970s. Don Ed Hardy, a formerly trained fine artist who had studied under Sailor Jerry and who brought to tattooing a level of artistic ambition and a breadth of cultural reference, drawing on Japanese, American and European traditions that had no real precedent in commercial Western tattooing. Cliff Raven, who brought a European fine art sensibility and an interest in esoteric symbolism to his work. Jamie Summers and Rollo Banks in the UK, who were developing similar ideas independently across the Atlantic. What these artists shared was a conviction that tattooing could be, should be, held to the same aesthetic standards as any other visual art form, that the fact that the canvas was human skin did not diminish the seriousness of the undertaking, that the best tattooing was not the reproduction of standardized flash designs, but the creation of original custom artwork, developed in collaboration between artist and client, designed specifically for the individual body that would wear it. This was a significant shift. The flash tradition, the wall of pre-drawn designs that customers chose from, had been the backbone of commercial Western tattooing for nearly a century. It was efficient, it was consistent, and it was, from the artist's perspective, relatively unchallenging. You drew the designs once, you kept them on the wall, you reproduced them indefinitely. The custom tattoo model required something different. Each piece was unique, each required original design work, each was a genuine creative collaboration. It was more labour-intensive, more demanding, and potentially more expensive. But it was also, for a growing number of people, more meaningful, because a tattoo that was designed specifically for you, that incorporated your personal imagery, your specific history, your particular aesthetic, carried a different weight than a tattoo chosen off a wall that 10,000 other people had also chosen. The custom tattoo was yours in a way that the flash tattoo was not. The tattoo renaissance also coincided with, and was in many ways enabled by, a broader cultural shift in the West regarding the body and its decoration. The 1960s and 1970s saw a significant relaxation of many of the conventions surrounding personal appearance. Long hair on men, previously the mark of outsiders and artists, became mainstream. Piercings beyond the traditional single earlobe became common. Dress codes relaxed across many sectors of society. The body, in this cultural moment, was being reclaimed as a site of personal expression rather than social conformity. Tattooing fit naturally into this shift. The tattoo renaissance also benefited from the development of new tattoo media, specifically dedicated tattoo magazines, and later, as the internet developed, online communities that allowed tattoo artists and enthusiasts to share work, discuss techniques, and develop a sense of the tattooing world as a global community of practice rather than isolated local shops. Tattoo conventions, which began in earnest in the 1970s and proliferated rapidly through the 1980s and 1990s, brought artists and clients together in ways that further accelerated the development of new styles and the spread of new techniques. By the 1980s, tattooing in the United States was beginning a demographic expansion that would continue with increasing momentum through the following decades. The biker subculture, Harlem-Davidson motorcycle clubs, of which the Hells Angels were the most famous, had its own strong tattooing tradition, and biker tattoos were visible in mainstream culture in a way that the tattoos of sailors and prisoners were not. Punk rock, which emerged in the late 1970s and had a significant relationship with tattooing as part of its broader aesthetic of transgression and anti-conformity, introduced tattoo culture to a younger, more middle-class audience than it had previously reached. And the gradual professionalization of the tattooing industry, better equipment, better inks, better training, better hygiene, made tattooing a more reliable and safer experience. The 1990s were the decade in which tattooing decisively crossed from subculture into mainstream culture in the United States and much of the Western world. The numbers tell the story. By some estimates, the number of tattoo studios in the United States roughly doubled between 1990 and 2000. Surveys in the late 1990s found that roughly 1 in 5 American adults had at least one tattoo, a figure that would have seemed extraordinary a generation earlier. The demographics of tattooing shifted significantly during this period. Tattooing had historically been predominantly male, in the Western commercial tradition at least. The 1990s saw a rapid growth in tattooing among women, driven partly by the popularity of specific placement choices, the lower back, the ankle, the shoulder, that were associated with feminine aesthetics, and that were more easily concealed, and therefore less professionally risky, than more traditional tattoo placements. The so-called tramp stamp, the lower back tattoo that became extremely common among young women in the 1990s and early 2000s, has since been subject to considerable cultural mockery, but its popularity was itself a significant demographic indicator. Tattooing was no longer just for men. The class demographics of tattooing also shifted. The association between tattooing and working class or criminal identity weakened significantly as tattooing became common among college-educated, middle-class young people. This shift was not seamless. Plenty of employers and cultural contexts continued to stigmatize visible tattoos throughout this period and beyond, but it was real and accelerating. By the turn of the millennium, a tattoo was no longer automatic evidence of membership in a specific stigmatized social group. It was evidence, at most, of a specific generational and cultural moment. Chapter 14. The Modern Era. Global Tattooing in the 21st Century. You are most likely sitting somewhere comfortable, or lying down if you're using this video for its intended purpose of helping you sleep, in which case, hello, welcome, we're getting near the end, you can relax. The year is somewhere in the 21st century, and you're living in a world in which tattooing has become, by any reasonable measure, one of the most globally widespread and culturally significant forms of body art in human history. The statistics are remarkable. Surveys conducted in the United States and Western Europe in the 2000s and 2000s consistently found that somewhere between 30 and 40% of adults in these countries have at least one tattoo, numbers that would have been unthinkable as recently as the 1970s. The global tattoo industry, studios, equipment suppliers, ink manufacturers, associated media, conventions and education, is worth billions of dollars annually. There are more professional tattoo artists working today than at any other point in history, and they are working at a higher overall level of technical skill and artistic ambition than ever before. The styles available to a person walking into a tattoo studio today would be genuinely incomprehensible to a tattoo customer of a century ago. In addition to the classic American traditional style, the bold lines, the limited colour palette, the iconic imagery of the flash tradition, there is American neo-traditional, which takes those same foundations and pushes them toward greater complexity and colour range. There is Japanese-inspired tattooing, both the traditional Irizumi style and more contemporary Japanese-influenced work. There is realism and photorealism, tattoos rendered with such technical precision that they appear to be photographs on the skin. There is watercolour tattooing, which mimics the loose blended quality of watercolour painting. There is geometric and dot work tattooing, which uses precise geometric forms and stippling techniques to create designs of extraordinary intricacy. There is black work, which uses dense black ink in bold graphic compositions. There is fine line tattooing, which works with incredibly thin lines and delicate details. There is biomechanical tattooing, which creates the illusion of machinery beneath the skin. There is illustrative tattooing, which draws on the traditions of illustration and comic art. The existence of this many distinct styles, each with its own masters, its own aesthetic conventions, its own community of practitioners and enthusiasts, is evidence of how fully tattooing has been incorporated into the broader ecosystem of visual art. Tattoo artists today train with the seriousness of fine artists. They develop distinctive personal styles. They have portfolios. They have waiting lists. They charge accordingly. The best tattoo artists in the world command prices that would not embarrass a gallery painter. The internet and social media have been transformative for tattooing in the 21st century. Instagram, in particular, has fundamentally changed how tattoo artists build careers and how clients find the work they want. A tattoo artist in Seoul can have followers in São Paulo, London and Sydney. A style that develops in one city can spread globally within weeks. The geographic limitations that once confined tattooing styles to specific regions, Japanese tattooing in Japan, American traditional in American cities, Polynesian tattooing in the Pacific, have dissolved almost entirely. Today you can walk into a studio in Berlin and get a tattoo in a traditional Japanese style from a German artist who learned from a Japanese master she followed on Instagram. This globalization of tattooing has produced both extraordinary cross-pollination and genuine concerns about cultural appropriation. The question of who has the right to use which traditional tattooing imagery, whether a non-Maori person can appropriately wear a design inspired by Tomoko, whether a non-Japanese person can appropriately receive a traditional Irizumi back piece, is a live and contested debate within the tattoo community and beyond. The answers are not simple, and they vary depending on whom you ask, which specific tradition you're discussing, and what the specific nature of the borrowing is. What is clear is that the indigenous and traditional tattooing communities, whose aesthetics have been most widely borrowed from, have strong and legitimate feelings about the matter, and that these feelings deserve serious consideration. The Maori, the Samoan, the Hawaiian, the Dayak of Borneo, all of these communities have spoken clearly about the significance of their tattooing traditions, the specific meanings embedded in their designs, and the ways in which careless or commercial appropriation of those designs strips them of meaning and disrespects the communities they come from. This is a conversation that the global tattoo community is still learning to have well. The revival of traditional tattooing practices in indigenous communities worldwide is one of the most significant and hopeful developments in the contemporary tattoo world. We have already mentioned the revival of Inuit chin tattooing. Similar revivals are happening in Hawaii, where practitioners of kakao, traditional Hawaiian tattooing, suppressed by missionaries in the 19th century, are working to reconstruct and practice the tradition. In Borneo, where the traditional tattooing practices of the Dayak peoples were similarly disrupted by missionary and colonial activity, there is a growing movement to document, preserve and practice these traditions. In the Philippines, the tattoo tradition of the Kalinga people, practiced by Wangod Ogay, who at over 100 years old has been recognized as a national living treasure, has attracted worldwide attention and a stream of visitors who travel to a remote village in the mountains to receive traditional hand-tapped tattoos from one of the last masters of the form. These revivals are not simply about aesthetics, they are about cultural survival, about the reconnection of communities with practices that were taken from them, about the assertion of identity and continuity across the disruption of colonialism and forced assimilation. The tattoo in these contexts is exactly what it has always been in the cultures that developed it, a mark of who you are, where you come from, and what you belong to. Chapter 15. The Science of Tattoos. What is actually happening to your skin? We have spent a great deal of time on the history and culture of tattooing. Let us take a brief detour into the science, because the biology of how a tattoo actually works is genuinely fascinating, and understanding it adds a layer of appreciation for the practice that history alone cannot provide. When a tattoo needle punctures your skin, it is doing so between 50 and 3,000 times per minute, depending on the machine and the technique being used. Each puncture goes through the epidermis, the outer layer of skin that your body continuously sheds and renews, which is why surface-level wounds don't leave permanent marks, and deposits a tiny droplet of ink into the dermis, the deeper layer of skin that is much more stable and long-lasting. Here is where the body's immune system becomes an inadvertent collaborator in the tattooing process. The moment foreign particles, the ink, enter the dermis, the immune system responds. Specialized cells called macrophages rush to the site and begin engulfing the ink particles, attempting to remove what the body correctly identifies as foreign material. This is the body's standard response to any invasion. Find it, consume it, eliminate it. But here is the catch. The ink particles, particularly in high-quality modern tattoo inks, are too large for the macrophages to actually process and eliminate. The macrophages engulf the particles and then, stuck, unable to break them down, simply stay in place, holding the ink. They become, in effect, permanent guardians of the pigment, stationed in the dermis for the rest of your life, or at least for the rest of their lives, because macrophages do eventually die. But when they do, they release the ink particles they were holding, and new macrophages arrive and engulf them in turn. The baton passes from one generation of immune cells to the next, which is one reason why tattoos, while they may fade and blur somewhat over decades, do not simply disappear. There is also a second population of cells that hold ink in tattoos, fibroblasts, which are cells involved in the maintenance of connective tissue in the dermis. These cells also engulf and retain ink particles, providing a secondary mechanism for long-term retention. The implication of all this is that your tattoo is not, strictly speaking, in your skin the way a drawing is on paper. It is in your immune system. The permanence of your tattoo is a consequence of your own body's defensive response, a response that got stuck, that took on ink and then could not let it go. There is something philosophically interesting about this. The body resists the tattoo and in resisting keeps it. The permanence is a product of the fight. Tattoo fading over time is caused by several factors. UV radiation from sunlight breaks down ink pigments, which is why tattoos exposed to a lot of sun fade faster than those in more sheltered locations. The gradual movement and blurring of ink particles in the dermis over decades causes lines to soften and details to lose definition, which is why very fine, detailed tattoos often age less gracefully than bolder designs with stronger lines. And the aging of the skin itself, the thinning of the dermis, the changes in elasticity and texture, affects how the tattoo looks over time. Tattoo removal, when it is pursued, typically uses laser technology, specifically Q-switched lasers that deliver pulses of light energy at wavelengths, absorbed by specific ink colors. The laser energy breaks the ink particles into smaller fragments that the immune system can actually process and eliminate. Multiple sessions are required because only some of the ink is broken down with each treatment, and because the body needs time between sessions to clear the fragmented particles. Removal is more effective for some colors than others. Black ink responds well to laser treatment, while some greens and blues are more resistant, and removal is never completely guaranteed to produce perfectly clear skin. There is often some residual ghosting of the original design. The health implications of tattoos have been a subject of genuine scientific inquiry. The concern that tattoo ink, which is largely unregulated in terms of composition, may contain harmful compounds is not without basis. Some tattoo inks have been found to contain pigments, also used in industrial applications, with limited testing for safety in the context of long-term dermal implantation. Nanoparticles of certain pigments have been found to migrate from tattoo sites to nearby lymph nodes, which has raised questions, not yet definitively answered, about long-term health implications. On the other hand, the evidence that tattooing causes significant health problems in the general population is, at this point, limited. Millions of people are tattooed every year, and the incidence of serious health consequences specifically attributable to tattoo ink, rather than to tattooing technique or hygiene, is low. The most common health issues associated with tattooing are allergic reactions to specific pigments, red pigments are the most common offender, infections from poor sterile technique, and the various complications that can arise from poor aftercare. The psychological dimensions of tattooing are also a legitimate area of scientific inquiry. Research has found that people who are tattooed report a range of motivations: self-expression, commemoration of important experiences or relationships, aesthetic pleasure, group identity, the desire to reclaim the body after illness or trauma, and that, in the majority of cases, tattooed individuals report satisfaction with their tattoos rather than regret. The popular assumption that people frequently regret their tattoos is not well supported by the data. Survey after survey finds that most tattooed people, even those who got their first tattoo very young, are happy with their decision. Chapter 16: Tattoos and Identity. Why people still do this ancient thing. We have travelled a very long way together, from Ötzi and his Alpine glacier, 5,000 years and more into the past, through the banks of the Nile and the courts of ancient China, and the wind-swept steppes of Central Asia, through the Pacific Ocean, and the temples of the Aztec and the ports of the maritime world, and the studios of modern cities. We have followed the tattoo across virtually all of human history and across the entire surface of the planet. And now, here, at the end of the journey, it is worth asking the simplest and perhaps the deepest question. Why? Why do people still do this? In an era of temporary tattoos and projected skin displays and 1,000 other forms of self-expression, why does the permanent, painful, expensive and irreversible act of getting a tattoo remain so powerfully appealing to so many people? The answers are as varied as the people who give them. Ask someone why they got tattooed, and you will get a different answer every time. To commemorate a lost loved one, to mark a milestone, a sobriety anniversary, a cancer remission, a graduation, a divorce, to feel ownership over a body that illness or trauma had made feel foreign, to belong to a group, to distinguish themselves from a group, because they thought it was beautiful, because they were 19 and it seemed like a good idea, and honestly it still does, because their culture required it, because their culture forbade it, and they wanted to make a point, because they were in the Navy. All of these answers are true. None of them is complete. What runs beneath all of them, I think, what connects Ötzi's therapeutic lines on his arthritic joints to the sleeve tattoo on the barista who just made your coffee, is something that might be called the desire for permanence. We live in bodies that are constantly changing, in a world that is constantly changing, in a culture that changes faster than any previous culture in human history. Everything is temporary. Everything is up for revision. Your opinions can be updated. Your relationships can end. Your address, your job, your hairstyle, your streaming service, all negotiable, all replaceable, all in motion. But the tattoo stays. Whatever else changes, this remains. The commitment is made, the ink goes in, and it is there, barring the considerable effort and expense of laser removal, for the rest of your life. In a world of radical impermanence, there is something profound about that. Something that speaks to a need so deep and so consistent that it has appeared in virtually every human culture that has ever existed. You are marking yourself, you're saying, this matters enough to make permanent. This experience, this person, this symbol, this aesthetic choice. It is worth more than the ability to change your mind. It is worth more than the professional inconvenience, the parental disapproval, the stranger's curious stare. It is worth the pain, and the money, and the hours in the chair. It is worth writing on my body, in the most literal possible sense. That impulse, to mark the body with what matters, is one of the oldest impulses in human history. It predates writing. It predates agriculture. It predates civilization as we understand it. It goes all the way back to a middle-aged man in the Alps who carried 61 marks on his skin as he made his final walk through the snow, 5,000 years before anyone thought to call any of this tattooing. The word is new, the practice is ancient. And somewhere between the two, between the ancient impulse and the modern practice, Between the therapeutic marks of a Neolithic Iceman and the hyper-detailed watercolour sleeve of a 23-year-old in a contemporary city, is the entire history of what it means to be human, marked, and alive. Chapter 17. Tattoos and the Law. Banned, regulated, and fought over. You're in a government office. It is not a particularly exciting government office. There are fluorescent lights and stacks of paper, and someone somewhere is making coffee that smells like it has been sitting on the burner since approximately the Meiji Restoration. But the conversation happening in this office is one that has been happening in various forms in various government offices around the world for a very long time. The conversation is about tattoos, specifically about whether the government has the right, or the obligation, to tell people what they can and cannot permanently put on their own skin. It is a surprisingly contentious question, and the answers that different societies have given to it, across history and across cultures, reveal an enormous amount about how those societies understand the relationship between the individual body and the collective authority of the state. We have already encountered several examples of governments attempting to regulate or prohibit tattooing. The Meiji government of Japan banned it in 1872. The Soviet Union regarded tattooing with deep suspicion and associated it with criminal and antisocial behaviour. New York City banned it in 1961. Various municipal and national governments around the world have, at various points, either prohibited tattooing outright or placed significant restrictions on the practice. The grounds for these prohibitions have varied. Public health is the most commonly cited justification in modern, secular contexts. The argument that tattooing, if poorly practiced, poses risks of infection and disease transmission that justify state regulation. This argument is not entirely without merit, as we have already noted. The question is whether the appropriate response to those risks is regulation, licensing of practitioners, hygiene standards, inspection regimes, or outright prohibition. Most jurisdictions that have wrestled seriously with this question have concluded that regulation is the more defensible approach. Prohibition tends to drive the practice underground, where hygiene standards are lower and the health risks are actually greater. The New York City ban of 1961, for example, did not stop people from getting tattooed in New York. It just meant that they got tattooed in less regulated, less sanitary conditions than would have existed in licensed studios. Religious and moral objections have been the basis for tattooing prohibitions in other contexts. We have already noted the Leviticus passage that has been cited by various religious authorities as grounds for opposing tattooing. In some contexts, certain conservative Christian communities, certain Orthodox Jewish communities, certain Islamic legal traditions, the religious objection to tattooing is taken very seriously and functions as a form of social prohibition even where it lacks legal force. In others, the religious prohibition has been encoded in law. In some countries governed by religious law, tattooing is officially prohibited or heavily restricted on religious grounds. The question of tattooing in employment and professional contexts is a related but distinct legal and social issue. In many countries, including the United States, the legal position is broadly that employers can set appearance standards, including prohibiting visible tattoos, as a condition of employment, as long as those standards do not discriminate on the basis of protected characteristics. This means that a person can be refused employment or required to cover their tattoos purely on the basis of their appearance. Courts have generally upheld employers' rights to set these standards, finding that tattoos are not a protected characteristic in the way that race, religion, or gender are. This legal landscape is shifting slowly as tattooing becomes more common and more socially accepted. Some jurisdictions have begun considering whether visible tattoos should receive some form of legal protection, whether refusing to hire someone because they have a tattoo is a form of discrimination that the law should address. In the United Kingdom, there have been cases challenging tattoo-based discrimination in employment, and while the courts have not yet recognised tattoos as a protected characteristic, the conversation is ongoing. Military regulations around tattooing have been another significant legal battleground, particularly in the United States. The US military has a long and complicated relationship with tattoos. As we have noted, military service has historically been one of the most significant vectors for the spread of tattooing in American society. But the military has also, at various points, attempted to regulate or restrict tattooing among service members. The Army, Navy, Marines and Air Force have all had policies which have changed multiple times in recent decades. governing the placement, size, and content of tattoos permitted on active duty personnel. These policies have been driven by a combination of concerns: the desire to maintain a professional appearance, concerns about tattoos with offensive or extremist content, and a more general institutional conservatism about visible body modification. The tension between these institutional concerns and the reality that a significant percentage of recruits, particularly from the demographics most likely to volunteer for military service, arrive with existing tattoos has pushed the military toward more permissive policies over time. Blanket prohibitions on tattoos are simply not compatible with maintaining the force levels that the military requires. The legal status of tattooing for minors is another area where significant variation exists. In most Western countries, tattooing minors without parental consent is prohibited, and many jurisdictions prohibit it even with parental consent. The logic is that a minor cannot give fully informed consent to a permanent body modification, that the decision to get a tattoo is one that should be made by an adult who can appreciate its permanence. This position is not without critics, who argue that it is paternalistic, and that teenagers are capable of making informed decisions about their own bodies. But it remains the legal standard in most places. The legal treatment of tattoo artists as professionals, as practitioners of a trade that requires licensure, training, and oversight, has evolved significantly in recent decades. Most American states and many countries now require tattoo artists to hold licenses, to demonstrate knowledge of bloodborne pathogen safety protocols, and to operate in facilities that meet specific hygiene standards. This professionalization of the legal framework around tattooing reflects the broader mainstreaming of the practice, the recognition that tattooing is a legitimate profession, practiced by skilled individuals on paying customers who deserve the protection of regulatory oversight. There is something striking about the arc of tattooing's legal history. It begins as a practice that the law ignores, too marginal, too associated with people whom the law does not particularly care about, to warrant specific legal attention. It then becomes something the law uses as a tool of punishment, of marking, of identifying criminals and slaves and enemies. Then it becomes something the law prohibits, in various contexts for various reasons, with various degrees of success. And finally, in the contemporary period, it becomes something the law regulates, recognized as a legitimate economic activity, subject to the same kind of professional oversight as other service industries, with its practitioners holding licenses and its customers protected by consumer law. The journey from punitive mark to licensed profession is, in its way, as remarkable as any other chapter in the history of tattooing. It reflects not just a change in the legal status of the practice, but a fundamental shift in how society understands what a tattoo is and what it means. The law, as always, is a lagging indicator of cultural change. But the direction of travel is clear. Tattooing has arrived, legally speaking, and the paperwork to prove it is filed somewhere in a government office, under fluorescent lights, next to a pot of terrible coffee. Chapter 18. Tattoos in Pop Culture. From sideshow to mainstream media. You're watching television, or a film, or scrolling through a social media feed, or flipping through a magazine, or consuming media in whatever form the current era has made most convenient for you, and the person you're looking at has tattoos. This is not remarkable. This is not even noteworthy. This is simply the visual landscape of the early 21st century, in which tattooed bodies are so common in media representation that their absence would be the thing worth remarking on. But this was not always the case. The journey of tattooing from the margins of popular culture to its centre is a story that tracks, with remarkable fidelity, the broader mainstreaming of the practice in Western society. And it is a story told through the specific people and moments that made tattooing visible, that put it in front of mass audiences in ways that shifted its meaning and expanded its appeal. The earliest prominent representations of tattooing in Western popular culture were associated with the sideshow. In the 19th century, tattooed people were exhibited as curiosities, human attractions who drew crowds at fairs, circuses and exhibitions by displaying their decorated bodies to paying audiences who would otherwise never encounter such a thing. The tattooed lady was a stock figure of the sideshow circuit, and real individuals built entire careers around being publicly, extensively tattooed. Nora Hildebrandt, who exhibited herself in the 1880s and 1890s, is sometimes cited as America's first professional tattooed lady. Emma de Berg, Betty Broadbent, and Artoria Gibbons were among the many who followed, each developing elaborate backstories, often involving dramatic and entirely fictional accounts of how they came to be tattooed, to add narrative interest to their exhibition. These tattooed sideshow performers occupy a complicated place in the cultural history of tattooing. On one hand, they were participants in a form of entertainment built on the exhibition of the unusual, and the other, a tradition that was often exploitative and that reinforced the idea of the tattooed body as a freak, a curiosity, something to be stared at rather than understood. On the other hand, they were also, many of them, genuinely skilled performers who exercised considerable agency over their own presentation, who earned good livings, and who were among the first individuals to make tattooing publicly visible to mass audiences in the United States. They normalized tattooing in the sense of making it familiar, something you had seen, even if only at a fair, while simultaneously exoticizing it. The association between tattooing and the carnival or sideshow world persisted well into the 20th century, and shaped the aesthetic conventions of American traditional tattooing in ways that are still visible today. The bold lines, the limited color palette, the iconic imagery, skulls, roses, eagles, daggers, anchors, of the flash tradition have their aesthetic roots in the visual culture of the sideshow, in the banners and posters and signage of the carnival world. The tattoo artist as showman is a figure who runs through this tradition. As the 20th century progressed, tattooing began to appear in popular culture in contexts that gradually shifted its associations. The link between tattooing and motorcycle culture, particularly the Hells Angels and other outlaw motorcycle clubs that became prominent in American consciousness in the 1950s and 1960s, gave tattooing a specific cultural valence: masculine, dangerous, anti-authoritarian, thrillingly transgressive to those who observed it from a safe distance. Films and journalism of the era reinforced this image, which both limited tattooing's mainstream appeal and gave it a powerful romantic charge for those who were attracted to the outlaw aesthetic. The rock and roll world was enormously significant in the cultural journey of tattooing from margin to mainstream. From the 1950s onward, musicians, particularly those in genres associated with rebellion and transgression, from rock and roll to heavy metal to punk, were tattooed, and their tattoos were visible in photographs, on album covers, in concert footage. The tattooed rock star was a powerful image that associated tattooing with creativity, freedom, and a kind of glamorous disregard for conventional social norms. Janis Joplin, as we mentioned, was among the first major female rock stars to be openly and visibly tattooed, and her tattoos, applied by Lyle Tuttle, received considerable media attention in the early 1970s that helped bring tattooing into mainstream cultural conversation. The heavy metal world of the 1970s and 1980s further embedded the association between tattoos and a specific kind of masculine rock identity. Bands like Motley Crue, Guns N' Roses and Metallica were heavily tattooed, and their fans, who regarded these musicians as avatars of a particular lifestyle and aesthetic, followed suit. The tattoo became part of the heavy metal fans' toolkit of self-expression, alongside the denim jacket, the band shirt and the long hair. Punk rock, which emerged in the mid-1970s as an explicitly anti-establishment cultural movement, had its own relationship with tattooing, one that was in some ways different from the heavy metal tradition, more deliberately confrontational and less concerned with glamour. Punk tattooing tended toward the raw and the DIY, reflecting the broader punk ethic of doing things yourself, rejecting professional polish, and using aesthetics as a weapon of provocation. The deliberately rough, hand-poked punk tattoo was a statement not just about personal identity, but about cultural values, a rejection of the sleek consumer aesthetics of mainstream society. The 1990s saw tattooing enter mainstream American popular culture through a wider variety of channels than ever before. The NBA, whose players were becoming more visibly tattooed through the decade, played a significant role, as players like Dennis Rodman and later Allen Iverson made heavily tattooed bodies a part of their public personas. Tattooing became associated with a specific kind of athletic, urban, black masculine aesthetic that was enormously influential in popular culture more broadly. The crossover between NBA-style, hip-hop culture and mainstream popular culture in the 1990s was one of the most significant cultural dynamics of the decade, and tattooing was threaded through all of it. Television discovered tattooing in this period in a serious way. Reality television, which became a dominant format in the early 2000s, found in tattooing a natural subject, dramatic, visually compelling, emotionally charged, and reflective of a genuinely significant cultural phenomenon. Shows like Miami Ink., which premiered on TLC in 2005, brought tattooing into American living rooms in a format that emphasized the personal and emotional dimensions of the practice. The stories behind the tattoos, the relationships between artists and clients, the drama of the shop. Miami Ink. And its numerous spin-offs, LA Ink., NY Ink., Ink Master, were enormously popular and played a direct role in the further mainstreaming of tattooing in the mid-2000s. Ink Master, which ran from 2012 to 2020 on Paramount Network, was particularly significant in its framing of tattooing as a competitive artistic discipline, a format that positioned tattoo artists alongside chefs, fashion designers, and other creative professionals in the well-established genre of the creative competition show. Watching skilled tattoo artists compete on technical grounds, precision of line, quality of shading, composition, colour theory, was an implicit argument that tattooing was a serious art form, worthy of the same kind of critical attention and competitive evaluation as other recognised art forms. For audiences who might never have set foot in a tattoo studio, it was an education. Social media, as we have noted, transformed the relationship between tattooing and popular culture in the 2000s in ways that are still unfolding. Instagram, in particular, became the primary platform through which tattoo artists built audiences, shared work, and developed the global following that allowed them to build careers independent of geographic location. An artist in a small city could become internationally known through Instagram, attracting clients who would travel across the country, or across the world, specifically to sit in that artist's chair. The democratization of visibility that social media enabled was, for tattooing, transformative. Celebrity tattoos remain significant cultural moments in the contemporary media landscape. When a major celebrity gets a visible tattoo, or removes one, it generates coverage, debate, and often a surge of interest in similar designs. The cultural weight of celebrity tattoos is a reflection of how central tattooing has become to the broader conversation about personal style, identity, and self-expression in contemporary popular culture. It is no longer news that a celebrity is tattooed. It is news when a specific tattoo is notable, when it's particularly large, or particularly meaningful, or particularly poorly advised. That last point, the poorly advised celebrity tattoo, is itself a cultural indicator. The existence of a robust public conversation about tattoo regret, about tattoo removal, about the specific perils of getting your partner's name tattooed on your body, is evidence of how normalized tattooing has become. You can only have a mainstream cultural conversation about the downsides of something that the mainstream already does. The tattoo regret discourse is paradoxically evidence of how fully tattooing has arrived. Conclusion: the long and inky road. And there we are, from the ice to the present day, from Ötzi to the tattoo studio on the corner of your street, from the mummies of Egypt to the revivalists of Samoa, from the criminal marks of Edo to the living art of Irizumi masters, from the sailors of Cook's Voyages to the Instagram portfolios of contemporary tattoo artists who can create something on your skin that looks like an oil painting. What a ride. If you're still awake, first of all, good evening. I hope I am at least vaguely interesting to you. Second of all, I hope you have come away from this with a sense of how deep this practice goes. Tattooing is not a trend. It is not a phase. It is one of the oldest and most consistently human things we do. It has meant 1,000 different things in 1,000 different cultures, and it has always, always meant something. The mark on the skin is never just a mark. It is a statement, a commitment, a record, a prayer, a protest, a memoir, a declaration of belonging. Whatever tattoos mean to you personally, whether you are covered from neck to ankle or have never considered getting one and never will, I hope you now understand them a little differently, a little more deeply, with a little more respect for the long and strange and beautiful history that every marked body carries, knowingly or not. Thank you for spending this time with me. Genuinely, thank you. If you enjoyed this, if it helped you drift off or kept you company on a long night, please consider subscribing. It truly does mean everything. And leave me a comment. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? I will be reading them, and I'm always delighted and a little astonished to find that these videos travel as far as they do. Sleep well, dream of something ancient, and we will see you next time.